What's up, guys? We're going to be talking about Cascade, inheritance, and specificity. These three terms are related in CSS, but they're all slightly different and represent important concepts in CSS that you need to be aware of. So let's start with inheritance. The key idea here is that some properties on an element are inherited from the parent. And a simple example of this is color. Imagine we have a div and we set color to red on the div. We then have a paragraph inside the div. The color of the text in that paragraph is going to be red. We didn't explicitly define color red on the paragraph, but it's inherited that property from the div. Other properties are not inherited. For example, width. The inner element won't inherit the width from the parent. Another example is border. It would be strange if we had a div and we set a solid 1 pixel black border and every element inside that div also had a solid 1 pixel black border. So we can see that some properties are inherited, but others are not. So let's just recreate those examples in practice. So we have a blank HTML document here. We are going to have a div and we'll give it a class of container. And inside that div, we'll have a paragraph and we'll put some text here. Let's style that div. So we'll target that class of container. We'll say color red. Let's refresh the page. So we can see our paragraph now has red text. If we inspect that element, we can see where it gets its CSS properties from. So notice in the bottom right, we have the class container, color red, and above that it says inherited from div. So this is not a native property of this paragraph. It's been inherited from the parent container. Taking a look at the MDN web docs, we can use the following values on a property to control inheritance. And likely the most useful of these will be initial and inherit. So initial is going to set the property value of the selected element to the initial value of that property. What that means is it's not going to inherit from the parent. So we can style a paragraph here. We can say color initial. If we refresh, we see the text turns to its default color, which is black in this case. Now, of course, we could just style a paragraph black if we wanted to. That would be fine as well. Now, let's experiment with a property that's not inherited by default, and that is the width. So let's set a width of 400 pixels on the container, and just so we can see it, we'll set a border of solid 1 pixel black. And neither width or border are inherited properties. Now, this example might seem a bit confusing at first, because if we also set a border on the paragraph, just so we can see how wide it is, we can actually see that it is as wide as the parent. So what's happened here? Has it inherited the width of the parent? No, it's simply that paragraph is a block level element, so it's automatically filling the full width of the container. It hasn't inherited that width. It's just taking up all available space by default. So what we could do is set display type on the paragraph to inline block, and now it will only take up the required width. So we can see, although the width of the parent is 400 pixels, the paragraph has not inherited that width. What we could do is set the value of width to inherit. Now the paragraph will inherit the width of the parent. Another thing we could do, instead of manually setting border solid 1 pixel black, is we could just say, although border is not an inherited property by default, in this case, we want the paragraph to inherit that from the parent. So we'll set border to inherit. And you can see we still have our solid 1 pixel black border. Whereas if we set this to initial, we won't have it because paragraphs don't have a border by default. But in fact, we don't even need that line of code because border is not an automatically inherited property anyway. So if you find an element's not behaving as you'd expect, for example, we have a paragraph here. We don't have any color property set on the paragraph, and yet the text is red. Well, it might be good to check for inheritance And remember, we can always remove any inheritance with color initial. But of course, if you wanted to, you could just overwrite the previous style with color black, for example. And this paragraph is now going to take precedence over the styling on the container. So that was inheritance. Let's take a look at our next CSS term, specificity. The idea behind specificity is it determines what CSS will do if it has two conflicting rules. If we have two conflicting CSS rules, the most specific rule will take priority. An example of this is that an ID selector is more specific than a class selector, which is more specific than an element selector, which is more specific than that wildcard all selector with the asterisk. So let's pretend that we have a class on our paragraph. And let's say we style the paragraph element, but we also have a class selector on that paragraph. So for our second rule here, the element selector, we'll set color green. We'll delete everything else just for simplicity. So we just have one property and value on that paragraph. But we're also going to use the class selector and we're going to have color red. So the question is, what's going to happen here? Both of these rules are styling the same paragraph. We have the paragraph selected via a class selector, and we have the paragraph selected by an element selector, i.e. any paragraph. Well, the idea is that that class selector is more specific because that P selector just refers to any paragraph in the entirety of the document. It's not especially specific, but .paragraph selector applies only to elements with the class of paragraph. So it takes precedence over the less specific element selector. So if we refresh our page, we see our paragraph turns red. Let's also give our paragraph an ID. There's no reason why the ID can't be the same as the class. So we'll set an ID of paragraph and we have a class of paragraph. So let's select that ID of paragraph and we'll give it a rule of color blue. The idea here is that the ID selector is the most specific because remember, IDs should be unique on a HTML document. There should only be one element with a specific ID. It's not like class where we can apply a class to as many different elements as we want. An ID should apply to a single element on a page. So if we save and refresh, now we see that our paragraph turns blue. Now, not everything is as simple as just an ID or a class or an element. As we've seen earlier in the course, we can actually create multifaceted selectors, and it can be important to know which one is going to end up being the most specific. So there is a whole system that's used to calculate specificity of selectors based on how many class selectors and how many element selectors there are in the selector. And there's a point system that's used. Now, in most cases, you probably won't need to worry about this, but just understand that there is a system. There's a calculation system when we have those complex selectors that determines which selector is going to be the most specific. And if you want to know the details of how this works, you can check the MDN web docs under how is specificity calculated. Now let's try one more thing. Let's create a conflicting rule. We're going to have two rules that target the ID of paragraph. So what do you think will happen here? We have an ID selector color blue, and we have a second ID selector on the paragraph color pink. Now they're both ID selectors, so they will be calculated as having the same specificity, and they're obviously conflicting with each other. So the question is, which of them is going to win? Let's refresh the page and find out. So we can see that second rule takes precedence. So this brings us to our third CSS concept, which is Cascade. One of the ideas behind Cascade is that rules declared later in a style sheet will take priority over rules declared earlier in the style sheet. And this is assuming the specificity is the same, because if that earlier rule has a higher degree of specificity, it's going to take precedence over the later rule that has a lower degree of specificity. So we've seen in our example that we had two ID selectors. We had a conflicting rule. They had the same degree of specificity because they were both ID selectors, but the later rule took precedence because it appeared later in the style sheet. It essentially overwrote the previous CSS rule. Now, if we look at our second bullet point there, it might appear to be saying the same thing, but it's a little bit different. So our second bullet point there says, rules declared later in the cascade take priority over earlier, regardless of specificity. And what we're really talking about here is something on a later cascade layer. So we obviously have two different factors at work here. We have something that could be later in the same style sheet, but we could also have something that's on a later cascade layer. And these are slightly different things. And this is actually a core part of how CSS works. If we think about CSS, it stands for Cascading Style Sheets. Again, if we visit the MDN web docs, we have this section here, Order of Overriding Declarations. So for example, the first style sheet that's used is the user agent or browser default style sheet. We then have custom user style sheets, then author style sheets. So those are the ones that we've been using as the developer. These are the cascade layers, and the order is very important because in the case of a conflict, a style or rule defined on a later cascade layer, regardless of the specificity. So that specificity is important when we have style sheets on the same cascade layer, perhaps even as part of the same style sheet. But when we're dealing with style sheets on different cascade layers, then the later layers always take precedence and the specificity is essentially ignored. Now, we've discussed the first three cascade layers. We then have important declarations in author style sheets, the same for user style sheets, and then the same for user agent style sheets. So what are important declarations? Important allows us to override any specificity calculation and ensure that a specific rule is employed. So returning now to our HTML document, at the moment, the ID selector with the color pink is taking precedent for that paragraph. Let's modify our element selector, the P, and let's use an exclamation mark followed by important. Let's save and let's refresh. So you can see, because we've used that important directive, that rule now takes precedence despite the fact that an element selector has a lower degree of specificity than an ID selector. Now, the general advice you will see is to try and avoid using these important directives. It's much better to understand why the rule we have written is not the most specific and change the specificity of our rule so that it takes precedent. That's the best way of dealing with things. There could, of course, be some situations where we don't have direct control over a part of the styling, and we might need to make use of the important directive. But in most cases, we can get away without using important, and we can just look carefully at the code and say, okay, this rule is not working because there is a higher degree of specificity earlier in the existing style sheet. So we could either delete those rules, or we could just increase the specificity of our current rule and ensure that it appears later in the document. So if we just set ID selector paragraph here, well, now we've increased our specificity, our rule is taking effect. We didn't need to make use of the important directive. So just returning to the MDN web docs, we can see that the order of the cascade layers are reversed when dealing with important. So keep in mind that author style sheets are more important than user style sheets, which are more important than user agent style sheets. But when we're dealing with important, then important declarations in the user agent style sheet will take precedence over everything. They'll take precedence over important declarations in the user custom style sheets, which will take precedence over important declarations in the author style sheets. So a really simple example of this, if we imagine a visually impaired user wanting to increase the font size on all of the web pages they visit, they could create a custom rule in their user style sheet, and they could apply the important rule to that, because otherwise it will be overwritten by later cascade layers. But obviously they want this effect to apply to all of the sites they visit and easily overwrite the existing rules on that site. So if they use the important directive, now they know their specific font size is going to be overwriting any of the styles set by the web developer of that site. So the order of the cascade is set this way for a specific reason. It's just something to keep in mind. Honestly, you probably won't have to deal with this most of the time. It's more a concept that it's good to be aware of because it's intrinsic to how CSS works. And then very occasionally you'll run into some kind of problem where a rule is not behaving like you think it should, but because you're now armed with this knowledge of how Cascade works, how the different Cascade layers work, you'll be able to solve that problem. Okay, so key takeaways from this lesson: the basics behind how inheritance, specificity, and Cascade work in CSS. Thanks very much for watching, guys. Catch you in the next part of the course.